Is the human species about to be raised to a new level of spiritual consciousness? That's what you'll hear in a lot of spiritual and astrological circles these days. And it's something we've been hearing for quite some time because it goes to the very heart of New Age thinking. But it's not the only utopian vision of the future doing the rounds now. The techno-optimists of the world claim we're on the cusp of creating artificial general intelligence, AGI, which will supposedly be able to improve itself exponentially and solve all of our worldly problems. We'll live forever in post-scarcity and explore the stars. It'll be just like Star Trek, but with less sympathetic characters. These are two utopian visions of the future, one centered around science, the other around spirit. And all of this is coming at a time when the UFO phenomenon is once again exploding into human consciousness in a way it hasn't done for decades. And strangely enough, that duality between science and spirit is very much present in the field of ufology too. Some see the phenomenon as essentially technological, a manifestation of advanced non-human intelligences with cool stuff that we want to get our hands on. And yet others see it as fundamentally spiritual, something that mystics and theologians of the past would have no problem interpreting using ancient cosmologies. In this video, I'm going to argue that technological utopianism, New Age ideas about spiritual evolution, and the UFO phenomenon aren't just strange sideshows of our current times. They are the show, and they're guiding some of those powerful trends and people in the world today. If all that sounds like your idea of a good time, then welcome to another weird and wonderful journey into the past to understand the present and the future. Now, before we really get into this, I just want to remind you that if you're interested in learning what astrology says about you and your life, you can book a private consultation with me. I'm focused on helping people to situate themselves in time, find purpose and calling in the world, and navigate these very strange times. And I'm also available for electional consultations where I will find you the best possible moment in time to initiate that important project that means everything to you. Whatever it may be, as long as it's not evil. Find the details in the description below. Thanks for listening, and let's get into this. In the first episode of this series, we saw how the synodic cycle of Pluto and Neptune speaks to the evolution of human faith, belief, and consciousness over time. And we saw how successive conjunctions of these planets provide us with a kind of meta-cycle of great ages that move through the signs one by one. In 1398 and 1399, we saw the first Pluto-Neptune conjunctions in the sign of Gemini for tens of thousands of years. The age of Gemini had begun. And it was the turn of Mercury, the god of the rational mind, of skepticism, analysis, and calculation, to take the reins in steering the collective consciousness of our species. And then we saw how the events that took place around those first Gemini conjunctions foreshadowed some of the great trends of the next 500 years of history. But in 1891 and 1892, we had a second set of conjunctions in Gemini, initiating the Pluto-Neptune cycle we're currently living through, one that will take us to the year 2385. So you'll no doubt have realized that we can use the themes that were swirling around the zeitgeist in the late 19th century to understand the nature of the current cycle and our current moment. And that's what we're going to be doing in this episode. But first, we're going to take a deeper look at the conjunctions themselves. This was a triple pass conjunction. The first came on August the 2nd, 1891, at 8 degrees and 37 minutes of Gemini. Second came on November the 5th the same year at 8 degrees and 18 minutes of Gemini. And a third and final conjunction arrived on April the 30th, 1892 at 7 degrees and 41 minutes of Gemini. Now, an important concept in astrology is what we call orbs. An orb is how far away two planets need to be from each other in degrees for us to be able to say that a given aspect or conjunction is in effect. I tend to follow the orbs recommended by Richard Tarnas because he literally wrote the book on this stuff, and he uses a 15-degree orb for conjunctions, although he has said that you can see conjunctions of snow planets coming into manifestation when planets are as far as 20 degrees from each other. Now, in my opinion, it's not worth getting too hung up about orbs because ultimately everything is in flow. Each moment creates the next. But I'm taking the conjunctional period as being roughly the last quarter of the 19th century and perhaps the first 5 years or so of the 20th. That's the period of time we should look to understand what was being seeded by these conjunctions and thus the storylines of the current cycle. But before we do that, we're going to look a little more closely into the particular part of the zodiac where these conjunctions took place, because it happens in a part of the sky inhabited by one of the most important stars in the firmament. If you're enjoying this video, please do let YouTube know that and click that little like button, because it really helps the channel. And do subscribe to make sure you are dialed in to the rest of this series. Now, an important element of astrology that I haven't delved into much on this channel before is the fixed stars. These are the stars of the firmament that comprise the constellations that make up the zodiac. They're called fixed to distinguish them from the so-called wandering stars, the planets that changed position and which caught the eye of ancient stargazers looking to understand the shifting nature of the moment. Now, every fixed star has lore and mythology associated with it. These are associations that have been passed down through religious and esoteric tradition for thousands of years. So it's always worth paying attention to the fixed stars aligned with conjunctions and important astrological events. And it just so happens that the Pluto-Neptune conjunctions of 1891 and 1892 took place in conjunction with a very important fixed star indeed, the star with the Arabic-derived name of Aldebaran, which means the follower. To the Indians, this is Rohini, and to the Persians, it was considered to be one of 4 royal stars, great guardians of the sky. It's also known as the Watcher of the East. Watchers are angels, and Aldebaran is the star of the Archangel Michael, the great spiritual warrior who is typically pictured slaying the dragon. Now, one of the best known guides to the lore of the fixed stars is the Fixed Stars and Constellations in Astrology, which was published in 1923 by a man named Vivian Robson. Robson was the curator of geology and paleontology at the British Museum, and he was also an astrologer. He had a great job. Now, many of the fixed stars were and still are used for magical purposes, and each has an image associated with it, which would be imprinted on talismans and used in magical operations. And here's what Robson says of Aldebaran. Its image is of God, or of a flying man. A flying man, you say? Well, that's an intriguing image, given what happened around the time of those Pluto-Neptune conjunctions. The late 19th century, the so-called Gilded Age, was a time of extreme materialism. Since 1842, conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn had been taking place in Earth signs, and so we were deep into an age of Earth at this point. These tend to be periods when we see the formation and solidification of hierarchical structures, when there's much more of a focus on the tangible aspects of reality. In the United States, certain titans of industry whose names are still known today made enormous amounts of money. Rockefeller, Carnegie, JP Morgan. But it was also a period of incredible progress in the areas of science and engineering. Most of the furniture of modern life was invented at that time. The telephone, the motor car, the moving picture, the radio, the electric light bulb, the gramophone, the bottle cap, the zipper, the smoke detector. The list goes on and on. And the combustion engine came of age at this time, but it was also an electrical revolution. Electricity had been discovered much earlier, but at this time, inventors like Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla were unlocking its true potential. And this period was also the dawn of heavier-than-air flight, when we made the first workable aeroplanes. Many of the early planes looked like mad steampunk contraptions, and some of them were literally steam-powered. But by 1905, the Wright brothers had made planes that could fly for miles, and the rest is history. The scientific method had evolved over the previous Pluto-Neptune cycle, but by this time, science was starting to achieve things that appeared truly magical. The dreams of the ancient magicians and alchemists were coming true. And to many people of the time, it felt like science was capable of solving all of mankind's great problems. Science was capturing the imagination, no longer as a rival to religion, but as a replacement. And it's no coincidence that this was the time when science fiction emerged as a genre of its own. It was a period when the godfathers of sci-fi were working, first Jules Verne, then H.G. Wells. And Wells, more than anyone of that time, anticipated the fantastic sci-fi anxieties that we still live with today. The Island of Dr. Moreau, published in 1896, was about a mad scientist who created hybrids between animals and humans. It's seen as the first book in which a more advanced species intervenes to raise the level of intelligence of a lower animal species.
Mr. Parker, do you know what it means to feel like God?
But the best known of all of Wells's writing is The War of the Worlds, published in 1898. That book, the story of an alien invasion of Earth, is well known for these lines. Yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. But with those words, Wells may have gotten closer to the truth than he could have imagined, because as he was writing them, strange things were appearing in the sky. Something we'll be taking for granted in this series of videos is the reality of the UFO phenomenon. That doesn't mean we'll be assuming that UFOs are aliens in spaceships coming to visit us here on Earth, but it does mean that we'll be assuming that at least some of the people who report sightings of strange objects and encounters with strange beings have genuinely had an encounter with a form of non-human intelligence in the parlance of our times. The phenomenon is something I've talked about on this channel many times before, particularly in these two videos that I made recently with researcher Bruce Fenton. If you're not open to the idea that the phenomenon is in some sense real, then I'm not going to try to convince you otherwise now. But I will say that there is a huge amount of compelling research out there written by very serious people that points to the conclusion that something very real and very important is happening. Two of those researchers are the French scientist and astronomer Jacques Vallée and the late journalist and paranormal researcher John Keel. Both of those writers point to the late 19th century as the birth of the modern technological incarnation of the UFO phenomenon, because around this time, thousands of people across the United States and then in other parts of the world were reporting sightings of strange airships. And these so-called mystery airship sightings are documented in dozens, if not hundreds, of newspaper reports. What's more, just like the UFOs of our current era, these airships could perform incredible maneuvers. And they were described as using extremely strong searchlights at a time when batteries weren't up to much at all. They were clearly not of their time. And they had strange but seemingly human occupants who would sometimes be seen making repairs to their craft or asking for directions or even taking people for rides. Now, I used the phrase technological incarnation earlier deliberately because another of the conclusions of Keel and Vallée and others is that the phenomenon is probably nothing new. It seems to have manifested in different forms over time. Humans have always seen strange lights in the sky, and they've always reported encounters with weird, intelligent beings that aren't human. Angels, demons, fairies, jinn, all the myriad entities spoken of in the folklore of the world. And of course, there's a whole school of thought that argues that the myths told by the great faiths of the world are really just accounts of encounters with aliens and their spacecraft. But that's another story. It was really in the late 19th century, during our conjunctional period, that we started encountering what looked like machines in the sky. Machines that were just ahead of where our own technology had arrived at that point in time. And another conclusion that researchers like Vallée and Keel have come to is that the phenomenon seems to be illusory, perhaps a great deception of some kind. That goes for the airships of the 1890s, as well as the more modern manifestations of UFOs to this day, because the phenomenon has consistently changed form over time. It's appeared as airships, literal sailing ships, strange lights and balls of energy, phantom rockets, phantom biplanes, flying saucers, triangles, spheres, and all sorts of other forms. And the occupants of these quote-unquote craft don't seem to have a consistent story about who they are or what they're here for. They tell us they're airship inventors, or from Venus, from distant stars. And like the fairies of yore, they take us on trips to other worlds where time seems to operate differently. They warn us, they admonish us. There are stories of people experiencing alien abduction while lying in bed next to a partner who insists they never went anywhere. We might think then that these are just phantasms, but the phenomenon also seems to be able to materialize physically in the world and to leave traces and strange materials behind. And of course, something to bear in mind is that it may not be monolithic. We may be talking about phenomena, plural, and interacting with more than one kind of non-human intelligence. Experiences with it can be inspiring or terrifying. In other words, the phenomenon is slippery. It seems to deliberately evade our understanding. But something to bear in mind is that the folk wisdom generally had it that you should never, ever trust the fairies. One of the reasons I think the phenomenon is genuinely important and not just some strange sideshow is that it emerged in this new form right at the time of a fresh round of Pluto-Neptune conjunctions. As we've seen, the synodic cycle of these planets speaks to questions of faith, belief, and consciousness. That strongly suggests that this phenomenon has to do with those themes too. Jacques Vallée has speculated that the phenomenon serves as a kind of control system, operating at a level that makes no sense to our conscious awareness, but seeding our imaginations and steering our destiny at the level of myth. Remember, the mystery airship sightings began just before H.G. Wells wrote War of the Worlds. And in his book, Operation Trojan Horse, which is a must-read by the way, John Keel claimed that the sightings literally inspired Wells to write his story. If that's true, then we have a direct link between manifestations of this phenomenon and one of the best-known pieces of science fiction ever written. And what do we know about science fiction? It's often inspired by myth. Think of Star Wars, which drew from all sorts of religious traditions and legends. And sci-fi inspires the technologists, engineers, and scientists of the world. This happens to apply to the two richest men on the planet right now, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. Both of them are shooting rockets into space, and both of them have cited science fiction as inspiring them to do what they do. So what am I really getting at here? Well, I'm arguing that if we take the late 19th century as a seed moment, which the Pluto-Neptune conjunctions tell us that it was, then scientism, with a capital S, seems like it may be one of the leitmotifs of this 500-year cycle. I'm using the word scientism here to denote a kind of belief system that turns science from a method into a faith of its own, one that, just like any faith, has its own axioms, its own assumptions. And those assumptions seem to be that science and technology can solve all of our problems, and that science is the only legitimate way to acquire new knowledge, and that there is no realm of spirit. Now, to be clear, this way of thinking wasn't totally new to the late 19th century. It had emerged over the previous Pluto-Neptune cycle, but I think it reached its apotheosis in the 1890s, during the conjunctional period, when science was showing it could perform its own kinds of magic. And another tenet of this religion seems to be that science will take us to the stars. That's obviously what the likes of Musk and Bezos believe. And it's also interesting to note that pop-punk ufologist Tom DeLonge named his UFO disclosure operation To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences. And so perhaps we could call this new faith not just scientism, but rocket scientism. So bear in mind, if I call you a rocket scientist, it may not be a compliment. This way of seeing the world became immensely influential over the 20th century. The space race captured a lot of people's imaginations through the Cold War period, and you can see how Bezos and Musk are trying to do that again in our current times, in which a new Cold War appears to be taking shape. And if you keep your eyes open, you'll see expressions of scientism all over the place. It's on your social media, it's on your TV, it's on mugs. If there's one phrase that sums it up, it might simply be the words, "trust the science," which we heard an awful lot in recent years. And soon enough, we might expect this slogan to take on a modified form, "trust the AI." but that's a story for a later episode. But was rocket scientism the only faith born in our conjunctional period? Well, I don't think so. Remember, Gemini always brings us things in twos. The end of the 19th century has a lot in common with our own times, because just as it was a time of unprecedented, rampant materialism, it was also a boom period for occultism. In 1875, a Russian mystic and aristocratic emigre to the United States named Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky founded an organization in New York called the Theosophical Society. And the system of belief that society promoted, Theosophy, was a kind of grab bag of ideas taken from Western occultism and the Eastern religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. Blavatsky claimed she had spent many years of her life wandering and seeking wisdom in Asia and was being guided by spiritually advanced initiates that she called the masters, who were hidden away in Tibet and were guiding the spiritual advancement of humanity. Note that once again we see inspiration here coming from strange beings whose existence is difficult to prove. Now, philosophically, Theosophy served as a kind of spiritual bridge between East and West. After a few years, it moved its headquarters to Adyar in what is now Chennai, India, and some of its most famous members include Gandhi and Nehru, leaders of the Indian independence movement. Theosophy held that consciousness, rather than matter, was the primary substance of the universe. And another key idea was that humanity had descended into a dense phase of materiality, but stood on the brink of entering a new, more spiritual phase of evolution and history. Ring any bells? In other words, it was really from the Theosophists that we got the idea that we're on the brink of entering a spiritual new age. And in 1887, Blavatsky herself wrote that the age of Aquarius was about to begin in a few years. So at the birth of a new Pluto-Neptune cycle, Blavatsky was proclaiming the beginning of a new age more than 30 years before Pluto was even discovered. The Theosophists believed in the doctrine of reincarnation, but they fused it with the idea of evolution prevalent at the time. And so a core concept of Theosophy was the idea of spiritual evolution, the idea that individual human beings and humanity itself were evolving towards states of greater spiritual advancement. And as the occult writer Gary Lachman argues in his book, Madame Blavatsky, it's hard to overestimate the influence that Theosophy ended up having on the world of ideas. Lachman says this: her contribution to modern spiritual thought and to modern culture in general is so great that it can easily be overlooked. And one more crucially important development that came out of the Theosophical movement was the revival of astrology. Over the course of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, during the first Pluto-Neptune Gemini cycle, astrology in the West had died away. And by the mid-19th century, it was thought of as a kind of embarrassing relic from science's past. But the Theosophists were open-minded to ancient wisdom, and one of their members, Alan Leo, has gone down in history as the so-called father of modern astrology. Leo and others revived astrology, but brought it back in a somewhat new form, one that emphasized spiritual evolution and free will rather than the more fatalistic traditional astrology. This is something I covered in the first video I made for World Astrology Report, and as I argued in that video, I think the revival of astrology at the time of the conjunctional period is a sign that the practice of astrology has a bright future over the course of this Pluto-Neptune cycle. And it's important to stress that Theosophy wasn't the only occult movement founded at that time. For example, there was also the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, from which this man, Aleister Crowley, emerged. So besides scientism, something else was seeded at those late 19th century conjunctions, and it had to do with the theme of spirit. It goes without saying that Theosophy and the other occult movements born in the late 19th century never ended up taking over the world themselves. But they didn't need to. As Lachman has argued, their ideas were hugely influential, and we see them all over the place today, especially in the tendency of a lot of modern people to identify as spiritual but not religious. There are huge numbers of people today who don't profess to follow any particular religious tradition, but nevertheless believe in the existence of a world of spirit, in reincarnation, in spiritual evolution, and in the idea that ancient peoples knew a lot of things that we don't today. And as Lachman says, we can trace this tendency back to Theosophy, to our conjunctional period, and it runs through the New Age movement that grew over the course of the late 20th century. And as with Theosophy, there's a chaotic, mercurial feel to the spirituality of today. It's as if people are in some kind of marketplace of spiritual ideas and are choosing which ones they wish to buy. And of course, there are some obvious problems with that. A lot of people have nothing but disdain for what they call the New Age. They'll argue that it's not a rigorous or reliable path to spiritual growth or salvation of any kind. But I wonder if that's actually the point. The new faith, if we can call it that, is not about blind obedience to a particular creed. It sets individuals adrift to find their own paths. Perhaps the whole point is that it represents a new kind of spiritual freedom, one in which people are given the responsibility of finding their own way towards spiritual growth, as well as the good, the true, and the beautiful. There's an echo here with the first Pluto-Neptune Gemini cycle. That cycle gave birth to Protestantism, a new form of Christianity centered around people having a personal relationship with God, one unmediated by the priesthood. Some people will no doubt scoff at this, but I wonder if we're seeing a new and somehow deeper iteration of that, in that we're now asked to find a faith of our own and discover for ourselves what spiritual practices work by experimentation. And I want to be clear that I think this spiritual freedom could lead many people back towards the established spiritual traditions. I don't think the great faiths of the world are going anywhere yet. With all that said, I could well be wrong about some of this. It's very early in this 500-year Pluto-Neptune cycle, and right now, if we compare it to the last cycle, we're roughly at the very early days of the Reformation, a time when nobody would have known where things were really heading. So it may well be that this new faith, if that's what it is, will indeed take on some more definite form and structure in the decades and centuries to come. We shall see. And so now, before we finish, let's try to sum all this up. Gemini is about wrestling with duality, and my best guess is that one great theme of this Pluto-Neptune cycle will be the battle between science and spirit. It's one that, in different ways, we're all going to be asked to wrestle with. And this is only going to become more true as technology, particularly information technology, infiltrates our lives at progressively deeper and more insidious levels. And to be clear, I don't think we're meant to choose one or the other, but technology, science, materialism, it should serve spirit and not the other way around. And one of my other conclusions is that the UFO phenomenon is playing a role in this battle. The themes of New Age spirituality, the cult of science, and UFOs are all deeply interlinked. And this can be traced through the history of the 20th century, and it can be seen in modern ufology circles today. But there's one thinker whose ideas lie behind a lot of what I'm saying, and that is this man, Rudolf Steiner, former theosophist who founded his own movement, Anthroposophy, which he considered to be a kind of spiritual science. We're going to be seeing a lot more of Steiner later in this series because, in my opinion, he, above all the great teachers of this current Pluto-Neptune cycle, had a deep insight into the true nature of what's really going on. And one more thing, I'm not suggesting that the world is divided into spiritual good guys and materialist bad guys. Nothing in this world is ever as black and white as that. Both science and magic can be used for good or ill. And many people who, on the surface of things, appear to be convinced materialists are privately nothing of the sort. As in the Gilded Age, as now, there are occult undercurrents to the workings of the world. Thomas Edison was a member of the Theosophical Society. JP Morgan, the Gilded Age financial titan, has been linked, perhaps apocryphally, with the phrase, "Millionaires don't use astrology, billionaires do." And perhaps, most interestingly of all, Albert Einstein is said to have kept a well-thumbed copy of Madame Blavatsky's book, The Secret Doctrine, on his desk. Some have even speculated that the inspiration for his famous formula, E equals MC squared, came from the pages of that book. That may or may not be true, but if it is, it provides us with a disturbing causal thread, one that runs directly from Blavatsky's hidden masters to Blavatsky herself, to Albert Einstein, and through to the construction of a technology that to this very day haunts our darkest imaginations and has done for at least 90 years. In the next episode, we're going to explore the history of nuclear weapons through the lens of astrology. And we're going to see how the Pluto-Neptune cycle not only tells the story of their development, but explains why today we're once again finding ourselves forced to live with the threat of nuclear war. Thanks, and see you next time.